The woman who cuts my hair recently told me a story. I'm always happy when she tells me a story because it means I don't have to tell her one. But it wasn't her story, it was an ancient one. An ancient one that day that Marie decided I needed to hear as she lowered my ears and tamed the cowlicks a few weeks ago. We Christian church people might call this sort of story a parable, and indeed some references to it are called the parable of the Chinese farmer. But the story itself is an ancient Chinese Taoist proverb, and it goes like this. There once was a poor farmer who lived in a little village, but this farmer was considered very, very rich and fortunate because he owned a horse. Now one day, his horse ran away, and his neighbors came to his farm and they all said how sorry they were for his misfortune. How unlucky you are. You must be so sad. What a loss. You've lost your horse. But the farmer only said, I don't know. It could be good. It could be bad. We'll see. Now, several mornings later, all by itself, the horse returned. And the horse brought with him 6 new, strong, beautiful, young horse friends that the farmer would add to his stable. And once again, all the neighbors came by, and this time they offered their congratulations. How lucky are you? You must be so happy. You have such good fortune. I don't know, said the farmer. It could be good. It could be bad. We'll see. Now, sometime later, the farmer's son went out riding on one of the new horses. But you know the thing about wild horses, they're wild. Out on the path, several miles from home, and all alone, the young man fell off the horse and broke both his arm and his leg. And when the neighbors saw him limping back into town with horse in tow, they once again came by, this time to console the farmer. How unlucky you are. You must be so sad. This is just horrible. And the farmer said, I don't know. It could be bad. It could be good. We'll see. A year later, a fierce war broke out between the farmer's country and the neighboring country. And all the young men of the villages were conscripted into the army. And when the army came to draft the farmer's son, they found that he was disabled, and they exempted him from service. I don't know, thought the farmer. It could be good. It could be bad. We'll see. Now this story, this parable, likely dates from a collection of stories written in the year 139 before the Common Era. And if it was written then, it had probably been being told for many, many years before that. And it is thus about 200 years older than the story of Pentecost we heard this morning. And it's an Eastern story. Perhaps, imagine with me that it might be a story that the Magi knew, those wise ones from the East, when they came to offer baby gifts that would prepare him for death. Who knows exactly how stories get around? Journalists, preachers, dramatists, teachers, hairdressers, we all have a knack for giving a good sermon every now and then, and often we hear them when we least expect them. And such was the case with everyone who gathered together in one place for the Jewish festival of Shavuot. This is the first sentence of the 2nd chapter of the book of Acts that we heard from Daniela this morning. And in this first sentence, we hear a couple rather sweeping narrative gestures. Listen slowly and see if you can spot them. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. It's a simple enough sentence, right? Easy to memorize, one we might all go out from here remembering today with the lightness of heart, thinking how good it is to be gathered all together in one place with a sweet, sweet spirit. It's one we might remember as the church's birthday, the gift of the Holy Spirit, our advocate and our friend arriving, and it is all of those things. But it's also the beginning of a tale. It's the beginning of a family story, and, well, you know all family stories can't be trusted. There are assumptions and also some redacting. The story we Christians tell today begins when the day of Pentecost had come, and this is the first narrative issue. Pentecost is a Christian word. A word for the followers of Jesus, those earliest disciples who knew firsthand the agony of Good Friday, the devastation of Saturday, the confusion of Easter Sunday, and the lingering sense of loss and mourning that still wouldn't loosen its grip. Pentecost comes from the Greek and means 50 days. Today is 50 days, again, not counting Sundays, from Easter. And right here at the start of our second chapter, our narrator makes a shift away from what was happening to what is happening. 50 days after the resurrection, in the fourth decade of the Common Era, there was no church calendar. We didn't yet exist. We're being born today, which means we didn't know how to talk about ourselves yet. But the narrator says they had all gathered on the day of Pentecost. What day of Pentecost those people wouldn't have known? Pentecost wasn't called Pentecost on that first day. Babies in Judaism aren't given their names for many years still to come. Do you hear this distinction? The story begins when the day of Pentecost has come, and it begins as if they knew what and who they were. It's as if they knew everything we know now. The narrator introduces this new word and a new way of counting that centers Christ's resurrection in a way that the world didn't yet know that first year. That first year, close to 2 millennia ago, there was no day of Pentecost for people to gather on or to wear red for, but there was another festival that would draw all these people together. In the Jewish faith, there is a holy day called Shavuot. Shavuot comes, get this, 50 days after the celebration of Passover. Shavuot, like Pentecost, is a holiday that maps itself to another holiday by counting days. Now, Shavuot, unlike Pentecost, does not revolve around the crucifixion and resurrection of Rabbi Jesus of Nazareth. Shavuot centers itself and celebrates on a much older covenant between God and God's people. And particularly for those of you who celebrate the New York holiday schedule called alternate side of the street parking suspensions, it occurred this past week. It was Monday and Tuesday. Shavuot comes 50 days after the second night of Passover, the Jewish celebration of freedom from enslavement. And it's not just that 50 is a nice round number that's easy to remember. Shavuot's use of the 50 is a reference to the 5 books of the Torah. 5 is a magic number. And it is sometimes referred to as the Festival of Weeks. Weeks after the ancient Hebrews left Egypt to seek their liberation, they find themselves in need of some directions for the path ahead. And while camped at the base of Mount Sinai, their leader, Moses, goes up a mountain and receives the 5 books of the Torah: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The 5 books central to Judaism that would then begin our faith too, where God promises to be their people's God and promises to never leave them. Note this allusion to the 50 days, the 50 days which we pick up on today. But right here, in how the author of Acts tells us the beginning of this story, our narrator uses a name, Pentecost, that would have been foreign, literally Greek to them, to quote, they all who were gathered there together that day. Now, we can make any number of rationalities for why this could be the case, everything from Christianity's propensity for supersessionism to narrative prerogative to the simple fact that the author of Acts is most likely writing a good 40 or 50 years after that first gathering, so maybe by that point it was called something else. It is entirely possible that this author knew that something else was going on that the first people experiencing it didn't yet know. Speaking to a contemporary audience, the author of Acts, like any author to any contemporary audience, was quick to forget the inconvenient details and to rewrite history. Think of this as an example for how a holiday becomes a holiday. Consider that from 1929 to 1983, There were only a few people that knew anything special about January 15th. Just a few, people who loved him. For 53 years, January 15th, to only a handful of people, was the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr. And then, in 1983, President Ronald Reagan decided to sign a bill into law, an act of storytelling itself, as we all know, that made one man's birthday a national holiday. And suddenly a country knows, and the world would follow suit. And the day changes, and meaning is made, and we mark time differently. Come back with me to the first story. Some 40 or 50 years after they all gathered to celebrate the day that they knew as Shavuot, the author of the book of Acts rechristens a Jewish day of observance with a name that we Christians would now know. And in doing so, also changes the origin story, the date from which it counted. No more would followers of Christ celebrate God's OG covenant with God's people found in the Torah. Now, we would celebrate a renewal of that covenant found in the life, death, and resurrection of Rabbi Jesus. That's narrative assumption number one, and we've barely 7 words into the book. The second issue with this sentence, for the close reader, at least for those of us from up north. Southerners may have no such problem with this, but there's the vague pronoun of they all. Who? How many? What is they all? Who were they gathered? Who are we talking about? By the time of the writing of Acts, which is written by the same author as the Gospel of Luke, which was written to a mixed audience of Jews and Gentiles, they all might indeed mean y'all. And whenever I question this, Matt is very quick to remind me that y'all means y'all. Yes, but who? Here in this story, we're not told who they all are. But yet they were all there gathered and remembering. But who matters? So this rather annoying pronominal generalization, we have to turn back a few pages to the middle of the first chapter of the book of Acts, where we find Peter standing and preaching to a group of Christ followers. And this group is footnoted by the author as being a crowd of about 120 persons, men and women, it notes, most likely including the 11 remaining disciples, as well as those faithful women who were also there at the Last Supper and at the tomb. That parenthetical in chapter 1, verse 15, is the closest antecedent to chapter 2, verse 1's they all. So let's take that as a leading contender for who all this author, whose narrative authority I am beginning to suspect is akin to one who begins a story with, "Call me Ishmael," rather than one who begins a story, "I am Ishmael." Call me versus I am. They all, without a number. Little ways to get into the story with our doubt and our faith. No story is a fact. Every story can have another way of telling it. So having broken down this first sentence about this day, having added at least a few other sides to the story, maybe we're now ready to try a fuller version of this first sentence. It's not as memorable. It doesn't trip from the tongue. But it might go like this. On the Festival of Weeks, which is to say 50 days from the Festival of Freedom, around 120 faithful women and men, Jews and Gentiles, all gathered in one place. Do you hear how much fuller the story is when we hold these ever-changing natures of stories in mind? When we expand our language and leave room for others to get in? When we imagine that it's not as simple as we want it to be? Can you also hear that no story is permanent? Nor is any way of telling it. And even here, even on this day that we now celebrate as 50 days from the promise of resurrection, the story can even now still be expanded. Nothing in all of creation is permanent. Stories themselves are ever-changing and impermanent by nature. What does this all mean? I don't know. It's good. It's bad. We'll see. Nothing is permanent. We gain by what we lose. We lose when we think we're winning. What do you think? I don't know. Even the things we thought were certain, like death and taxes, turns out to those of us who believe in the resurrection or live under a crumbling federalist structure, neither of these things seem very certain either. Impermanence, uncertainty, change, these are certainly true. And whether it's a Chinese parable, a gathering of early Christ followers, or even just the dawning of this day, hold on tightly and let go lightly. It's 50 days after the celebration of Passover in that same year that Jesus died. Jesus died. This wasn't a celebration day. His memory was still with them. 50 days from that resurrection, 120 people or so gathered in a room to all be together and to remember a promise of God to always be with them. Why? Because just 50 days ago, maybe some of them, or maybe all of them, had gathered in another room. Or maybe, because the story doesn't tell us, maybe we could let our imaginations go to, maybe it was this room. Maybe 53 days ago, 120 faithful Jews gathered in an upper room for the celebration of what they knew as Passover, and what the church in its time would come to call the Last Supper. They didn't know. 50 days from Passover to Shavuot. 50 days from Easter to Pentecost. 120 people being the closest thing we can imagine to who was in that room that first day we now call Pentecost. Who knows, maybe this same they all are who gathered in the room that we now call the Last Supper. And on that first day, on this first day that we now call Pentecost, 50 days from the Christian celebration of liberation and even from death, what happened? You heard it. The Holy Spirit arrived and filled the house with a rush of dynamic, life-changing, totally unexpected. This was not scheduled, folks. This was not what they had come for. It wasn't a celebration of what had happened like what we get to do this morning. They had no idea. 50 days from death. Mourning, loss, untold pain. Locked in a room, just to be together, to remember the oldest stories they could. And the Holy Spirit arrives. An uninvited guest to fill them all. And this power filled the house with a rush of dynamic, life-changing, totally unexpected power. Power that lived like flaming tongues on each of them that they could see. Comfort that filled them with new language and, more importantly, to understand old languages. Healing that brought them all together as the Spirit gave them their ability. And they were astonished. And it was loud. And it felt dynamic. And for others, it was a still small voice that was inside that they couldn't yet voice, but they could nurture and it would grow. And they were astonished. And some of them spoke in languages or just using words that they had never before been able to speak. And others of them listened in ways they had never before listened. And they were astonished. And maybe we can too.